Chapter 1. The Coming Storm.
You live and serve in Arifis, you said? That is only a 3-day journey. Being so close to Gavin, I am intrigued to know your thoughts on the matter. What do you think?
Asked a sturdy yet calm voice. The words belonged to an elderly man dressed in white robes trimmed in gold, signifying a high rank within the divine order. He had wrinkly, pale skin, and he kept his head shaved in the normal priestly style. He was tall and thin, with a long nose and light brown eyes. Around his neck was a golden amulet, fashioned into the shape of the Grecian holy symbol, and on his left middle finger rested a gold ring, shaped like a gliding eagle, the symbol of the goddess Otera.
"I think," replied another masculine voice, "that you worry too much, Lord Vehemenarten."
The man's voice was relaxed, and sounded somewhat amused.
"We both know the coast is where Otera and Helon collide. There have always been repercussions to their battles, and there have been many storms and hurricanes. These hard times will pass."
He hesitated before continuing.
"We should remind the people to offer more sacrifices. There's little else to do if the gods decide to quarrel, and the festival is only a month away. Say what needs to be said, and let yourself relax. If you, along with the rest of us, remain calm, the common people will follow suit."
Just then, far in the distance, another bolt of lightning streaked through the air. They were growing closer. A storm was coming in from the west, dark and terrible. Thunder boomed and lightning crackled across the sky, illuminating everything in a brilliant white light. Waves crashed hard against the cliffside, and the boats and ships in port teetered violently atop the dark water. It was a little after midday, but the sun was covered by thick clouds. The air smelled of ozone. Yet other than that, everything was calm. The calm before the storm. The two men stood on the large, circular balcony which protruded from the side of Gavin's temple. The magnificent white stone building lay on the northwestern part of the city, atop a large hill known as Aligar's Hill, named after an ancient war general who had died in battle whilst purging the land of Hittite armies. The balcony was made of fine stone and stretched out about 30 feet from the main part of the temple. There was an angled roof which hung over the top so to keep the priests from being bombarded by rainwater, but the rest was open, allowing anyone standing there the opportunity to view the western half of the city, including the Hanora River, which ran right through the center, cutting Gavin in half before pouring out to the radiant sea. The balcony was covered with potted plants, and the columns that maintained the ceiling were coated in lush green vines which twirled around the stone like snakes. Right now, there were nearly 30 priests standing outside, either conversing or observing the oncoming storm. Some were from Gavin or its surrounding cities, such as Vehement Lycio, while others, such as Arten, had been called in from other cities and kingdoms for counsel. At the moment, they were simply waiting for carriages to arrive and take them to King Galen's keep. As Arten stood at the edge of the balcony, he could not help but admire the beautiful landscape. The city lay on the northeastern coast of the Radiant Sea, within Fisher's Bay, and near the Black Peninsula, where enormous, jagged ebony rocks jutted out of the earth. It was the capital of the south and was debatably the most prosperous throughout the entire Grecian kingdoms, and was ruled by King Galen, a member and descendant of the old and great House Solaris. The city was also renowned for its beautiful coastline and plethora of resources, especially fish. Normally, the weather was sunny and the air breezy, but for months now, storms had racked the area, forcing the fishing boats out of the waters, along with many jobs. Most of the farmers' crops had been destroyed as well, and with Gavin's annual festival, known as the Diwi Akal, approaching, the citizens were growing more and more anxious with every passing day. Not long before Arten and the other priests had been called to the capital of the Riverlands, the common people had begun to claim that the gods had cursed the land, and had immediately gone to the temple to demand answers. When the clerics, known as the Vehements, were unable to produce desired results, the locals had begun revolting. Nothing utterly terrible or destructive had been wrought by the hands of the citizens, but rumors had begun to spring up throughout the city, rumors which caused both the Vehements and the king to grow worrisome. It was then that Gavin had sent for aid from the other priests throughout the kingdoms. At the very least, they hoped that seeing such a large amount of clerics would help calm the people's nerves. The Lord Vehement took his time replying to the other man's words, long enough for Lycio to feel the need to respond to his own comment.
"I do not believe these people are under as much condemnation as you think they might be," he said. "The gods are flexible, and if they have done something worthy of punishment, Otera, Helon, and the others will forgive them, given enough time and sacrifice. But if you are so concerned, Lord Vehement, I recommend we do as I mentioned earlier. We should stay until after the festival. That way, we will know if the gods are truly displeased. As of now, I still speculate it is simply a skirmish between the rivaling gods, nothing more. And Facidia and Tewa will not dare tolerate the other two spoiling their week of worship." For the first time since beginning their conversation, the Lord Vehement turned his attention away from the city below and glanced at Lycio, a knowing and disdainful look on his face. Lycio was young for a highly ranked Vehement, only 36 years of age. He had dark, squinting brown eyes, a large round nose, olive skin, a plump body, and eyebrows so thin they were almost non-existent. His head was shaved like all the priests, and he was dressed in the same white robes, except Lycio's was trimmed in light purple instead of gold, signifying his specified deity of worship was Facidia, goddess of fertility. There was no extravagant ring on his finger, however, revealing he was not quite yet a Lord Vehement. Arden hoped that would never happen.
"Oh, is that the reason you wish to stay for the festival?"
The Lord Vehement's words were heavy with sarcasm, his tone accusing.
"I did not know you were so concerned with the welfare of Gavin's people, seemingly by your own words."
Lycio's face reddened. "I am a priest of the Divine Order," he said, his voice growing angry, albeit not loud enough to draw the attention of the other nearby clerics. "Of course I am concerned. What are you insinuating, Lord Vehement?"
Arden did not like the man's tone. "You know exactly what it is I am implying," he said. "Do not forget your place, Vehement Lycio, and do not forget our purpose. We are the light that binds the kingdoms of Grescia together, and if we begin to fail in our duties, then the entire realm will bleed alongside us."
Lycio straightened his back in an attempt to make himself seem more composed than he was, but both the redness in his face and the heaviness of his breath gave him away. "If you are only going to dismiss my input and question my honor," he said, each word emphasized, "then why ask to speak with me at all?" The Lord Vehement's words were direct, yet not unkind.
"I'm here to find the source of the problem in Gavin, am I not?"
Lycio visibly welled with anger. He opened his mouth to say something, but instead closed it, his beady brown eyes fixed on Arden. Through the corner of his eye, the Lord Vehement was able to see Lycio's double chin shaking underneath his jaw as the man angrily searched for the right words to say. "If I were you," Lycio said carefully, "I would look to myself for fault, Lord Vehement, for it is you, not I, who has brought a heathen and an outsider into our holy order." Then, in order to try and get the last word in, he turned and left. After taking a few steps, though, he stopped and turned back, dipping his head in a small bow. "Lord Vehement?" he said before spinning around again and strutting off, his double chin held high. Arden sighed as he turned his attention back to the oncoming storm. Rain was now beginning to fall upon the western parts of the city. The streets were as quiet and motionless as death. The citizens were preparing for the storm to come. For a moment, Lord Vehement Arden felt guilty as he looked down from the balcony. He felt guilty for being up here, in the Temple of the Gods, safe inside one of the most structurally stable buildings in Gavin, while the common people were left to fend for themselves as the onslaught of yet another storm fell upon them.
"Is this truly another skirmish between the gods, or is there something else?"
He pondered deeply as he continued to look out over the temple balcony.
"No, there is something else here. But what? What is it I am not seeing? Show me, Lady Otera, if thou art willing."
His thoughts were interrupted, though, by the soft sound of padded footsteps approaching from behind. Arden turned slightly, allowing himself to view who was drawing near. Through the corner of his eye, he distinguished a young man dressed in white robes, except his were not trimmed in any other color. They were solid white, signifying he was a reticent, the lowest rank of cleric within the Divine Order. The Lord Vehement recognized him immediately. The boy's name was Lysim, and because of Arden's approval, had been permitted to come to Gavin to see, learn, and observe the ways of the Order more fully. He was of average height, yet muscular, despite having spent his entire life within the Temple of Stoneridge. His head was shaved like all the priests, and round his neck was a holy amulet, the same which dangled around the Lord Vehement's own neck. Lysim stuck out like a sore thumb, however, due to his nationality. He was technically a Tahite, born in the desert. But as a babe, Arden had found him abandoned, and so he had decided to take the child in and raise him as his own within the temple. While the other clerics had either fair or olive skin, Lysim's was dark. His eyes were also slightly slanted and almond-shaped, unlike the Grecians' generally round eyes. His face was long, and so was his nose. Whenever he smiled, his bright white teeth shone in stark contrast to his dark complexion. But, even for a Tahite, Lysim was distinct. All along his body were pale white patches and streaks, like a large birthmark which ran along the majority of his body. This was what Lycio had been talking about.
Within the culture of the desert tribes, there were sometimes people born with this unique skin pigmentation, known as Al-Kabur. According to the myths and folklore of the desert tribes, the Al-Kabur were said to have various abilities, such as seeing the future, healing the sick, or being able to communicate with the dead. Lord Vehemenart never believed in such things, which is why he'd been willing to take him in and raise him in the Grecian faith. Many of the other clerics, however, were not fond of the idea of allowing a desert witch doctor join their church.
He looked displeased, Lysim said, a slight smirk on his face. His voice was quiet and calm as he stepped near Arden and gazed out over the balcony alongside him. What did you say this time? The Lord Vehement often forgot Lysim was only 17 years of age, due to his calm nature. He had an old soul, and spent most of his days praying before the gods or studying ancient texts within Stone Ridge's temple library. But now, a boyish smile streaked across his face. The old man tried not to let himself smile back, but it was nearly impossible. He just made sure not to let the other men see.
He and I were simply having a conversation concerning the gods.
His voice still held a hint of humor.
And if I happen to mention my suspicion of his extracurricular activities, who is to blame? I am but a meek, elderly priest.
Oh, of course, Lysim said, still sounding amused. You're such a weak old thing. How could you possibly be guilty of offending another Vehement? You most likely do not even recall what you ate this morning. They shared a subdued laugh. There was a long moment of silence as the two robed clerics stood there, watching patiently as the dark clouds rolled in. Every now and then, a thunderous boom would echo through the sky so powerfully that both Arden and Lysim could feel the force reverberate through their bones. Breaking the silence, Lysim gestured toward the door Lycio had left through moments before, and asked, "What did he think of these storms?" Arden took a long, deliberate breath before answering.
Vehement Lycio believes these storms are nothing more than a simple argument between Otera and Herelon.
He opened his mouth to continue speaking, but instead held his tongue, thinking it best not to intentionally speak badly about a fellow servant of the faith. Lysim had such a kind, simple soul, and Arden did not want to blemish it with his own negative opinions. If anything, he figured the boy should draw his own conclusions on the affairs of the order.
He thinks, Arden continued, that as of now, we should continue to pray to the gods and offer sacrifice, and we should encourage the common people to do the same. He claims that if we stay until after the Diwiakal, we will be able to distinguish whether or not the gods are actually offended by the people of Gavint.
Lysim rested one of his elbows on his other forearm and raised his hand to his chin as he pondered the elderly man's words. He did not say anything for a long time. "And what do you think?" the unseasoned cleric finally asked. Arden stroked his own chin in harmony with Lysim.
"I think," he said, "there are too many similar occurrences within the surrounding realms for it to be a coincidence. I do not deny Vehement Lycio's logic in the sense that it is most likely a battle between one god and another. But the question is which gods, and for what purpose? It very well could be a skirmish between Herelon and Otera, but that does not make much sense to me. If it is a fight with the sea god, then why are other places suffering as well, far from the coast?"
He waited to see how Lysim responded, and as he suspected, the young Tahite's dark eyes widened as he shot a curious glance back at him. "What do you mean?" he asked. Arden almost laughed at the boy's enthusiasm for knowledge.
"There have not been storms as consistent as these in decades," the elderly man said. "I am not convinced this is nothing. And it is not just here, either. Many southern cities have been experiencing various oddities. Springcrest, for example, along with its surrounding cities, have not had rainfall in over a year now. That, along with these rampant coastal storms, I think there may be something happening here we do not yet see. And I am not convinced the fault does not lie with us in some way. I simply do not know. But there is something in the air, something larger than my mortal vision permits me to comprehend."
Lysim soaked the information in like a sponge. He, like the Lord Vehement, turned his attention out toward the storm as he once again rested his chin atop his knuckles. Arden waited to see if Lysim would respond, but he did not. He only stood there, pondering, as he stared out into the clouded sky. More often than not, he liked to leave the boy to his own thinking, allowing him the opportunity to try and find his own solutions. But other times, like now, he simply wanted to know what the young man thought. Occasionally, he liked to push the cleric's progress forward.
"Let's alter the way we're approaching the situation,"
Arden said, coercing Lysim into deeper conversation.
"We shall focus on things we can control, so let us assume there is indeed something wrong within the city of Gavint. Let us assume the gods are wroth with them, and it's because of this anger they have decided to plague these citizens with such rampant storms."
He hesitated a moment.
"What," he said carefully, "do you think could possibly be wrong? What could be causing this?"
Despite the fact Lord Vehemenarton sounded as if he already had the answer and was simply tutoring him, he was in fact hoping the boy might shed some light on the circumstance. He waited patiently for his response. While Lassim reflected on the question, another bolt of lightning streaked across the sky, quickly followed by thunder so loud that for a moment the old Vehement half believed the temple roof might crumble. The boy's next words did not surprise the old priest, though, at least in the sense that he decided to reference the old texts of the Westerlands, across the ocean, which were written almost 1,200 years ago. The set of scripture was known as the Varn Kama. Notwithstanding this, he was surprised by the cleric's interpretation of the text. "Not long ago," Lassim said carefully, "while studying the Varn Kama, I came across an intriguing scripture written by High Lord Vehement Folar during his mission in Unthia." He waited a second, scrutinizing Arton to observe how he was reacting, but quickly continued. "I was reading the chapter where both he and Lord Vehement Enros prayed for 30 days and 30 nights for Otera to bless the land with rain."
"Yes, of course. Otera then answered their prayers and honored their sacrifices with a storm which lasted a month. Crops grew, the people of Unthia survived, and they were later converted to the holy faith,"
Arton interrupted. Seeing as how Lassim had decided to emphasize his worship on Otera, as he too had done in his youth, it was no surprise the boy had been studying that specific chapter. "Exactly," Lassim continued, "but part of the wording caught my attention." The old man raised an eyebrow. "It says, 'And the heavens were opened unto them, and their eyes did see. Thus, when their eyes were opened, did their hearts become one, and they lived in the light. And together they rejoiced. Together, one helped the other, and they did make sacrifices unto the goddess one last time. Then did rain fall upon the earth for 30 days and 30 nights, according to the days of their prayers.'"
"Yes, and what of it?"
the Lord Vehement inquired. Lassim's eyes sparkled with ardor as he continued. "As I was reading, I noticed that specific chapter never clarifies who they are. It only says they. Are they the Vehements, Folar and Enros? Are they the Unthians? It doesn't specify." This time, the young cleric did not wait to see the old man's reaction. "I then began digging into texts written by other priests concerning the passage, and I found one's view particularly interesting to me. He claimed it was possible that over the centuries, the writing had either been misinterpreted or tampered with, and he also gave some interesting insight on what the phrase 'lived in the light' could have meant, which is the part I found most intriguing. He then goes on to quote other scriptures indicating the same."
"And who was this Vehement whose writings you studied?"
Arton cut him off. His tone was now dark and serious, and his gaze was fixed harshly on the young cleric beside him. As soon as Lassim noticed Arton's sudden change of mood and piercing eyes, he bowed his head humbly and clasped his hands behind his back, although he was unsure as to why the elderly man's countenance had so abruptly switched.
"Well?"
Arton asked. Lassim took his time answering the question, trying to decipher his mentor's expression and tone. "Vehement Merifel," he eventually replied, his voice cautious.
"I do not know how you found his writings,"
Arton said sharply, straightening his back.
"but he was a heathen and a blasphemer. We do not speak of him, we do not acknowledge him, and we certainly do not try to interpret his malicious mind."
Lassim was genuinely and profoundly confused. It had been over 100 years since Vehement Merifel had written those words. The elderly man's posture relaxed a bit once he saw the disconcerted look on his pupil's face.
"You must disregard all you have read concerning that interpretation of Scripture. You are a good boy, and steadfast in the faith. I do not wish to give any of the other Vehements reason to try and expel you from the order. You must promise me you will avoid that heretic's writings at all cost, and you must never mention you are studying his works."
Lassim nodded his head in agreement, although still puzzled. He wanted to ask what the priest had done to have been branded in such a way, but he knew not to push his mentor too far, so he kept quiet. As soon as Arton saw Lassim nod in agreement, he returned his gaze back to the city. His voice relaxed.
"As soon as we have returned to Stonebridge," he continued, "I will have the library searched, and his writings will be destroyed."
He glanced back to the young cleric before saying,
"I assume his writings were accidentally brought to Stonebridge from Agos a few decades ago, when our reticents were ordered to transcribe some of their books. In an odd way, I am grateful you found those texts, Lassim. Otherwise, they would have sat underneath our temple for who knows how long, waiting to pollute the minds of future clerics."
He turned his vision back to the edge of the balcony.
"Perhaps this is a sign we will find the hidden issue behind Gavin's misfortune, just as you have discovered the unknown texts of this blasphemer."
Just then, the doors to the balcony swung open, and a reticent stepped out. Raising his voice, he informed the group that the carriages had arrived.
"It seems we must finish our discussion later," Lord Vehemenarton said. "Notwithstanding what you have told me today, I still desire to hear your thoughts on my previous question, and now you have time to rethink your answer. I recommend learning how to get to your point more quickly."
He placed a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder before turning to make his way toward the door, alongside the other priests, leaving Lysim alone on the balcony to ponder the events which had just transpired.